Okay, this is what Jane Greer said about Howard Hughes. Jane talked about our romance. Howard Hughes was an oil man. Then he was a Hollywood director. Then he was a layer of starlets, if you will. He was a huge ladies' man in Hollywood. He literally would find these starlets, these very young women who were trying to make it in Hollywood, and he would buy little bungalows that he would put each of them in, keeping in mind he's extremely wealthy. And he would literally have these women all over Hollywood, these beautiful young women that lived in all these little places that he himself was paying for, and then he would just go visit them all. And also he was making it with all these different, leading ladies and women. I mean, he was a huge raconteur and ladies' man when he was a young man in Hollywood. Jane Greer is another one. Jane talked about her romance with Howard Hughes, so I said, well, let me talk about Howard Hughes, Windsor said. So the next day we went to formal dancing at the top of the Waldorf, and he was in his white tennis shoes. He had dinner and danced, and he took me home and kissed me on the cheek. The next day he called and asked me to dinner again. After that, I never saw him again. Just making the point again about these friggin' white tennis shoes. Here's a story called An Ode to Keds from 2009. I guess he liked to wear white Keds. Duh, I keep mentioning Keds. Aviator, filmmaker, icon Howard Hughes was also famous for sporting his white canvas Keds with suits. That's another article. Here's a different article. This is interesting. This is a reminder that there used to be a thing called prohibition when liquor was illegal. I'm not even going to sort some of this stuff. It's just something that I printed off that I was reading about, looking for stories of Howard Hughes and his white Keds tennis shoes. That's what I picked up on when I read that story, like the second time when I slowed down and really read the words carefully. Why is a man in a suit wearing white tennis shoes? Why does Forrest Fenn assume these men are escaping the rigors of Washington? There's an unsaid story there. That unsaid story is the way you or I are going to find this treasure. Figuring out the unsaid story. He hints at things. He drops things in front of us. He dangles things in front of us like we're fish. And we either see them or we don't. But if you see them and you pursue them, sometimes really interesting things can happen, especially in the day of Google and the internet. Don't underestimate the internet in your search for this treasure. Ben has never said don't use it. What Ben has said is you do not require special knowledge to figure that out. I think by that he means you don't have to be a doctor, you don't have to be an astrophysicist, you don't have to be someone that knows cuneiform, you don't have to know someone that can read hieroglyphics. You just have to have a pretty good brain, I would say. Whoever finds it's probably going to be a pretty smart person. They might be an unusual person. They might have some quirk. They may have some OCD things that makes them pick up on stuff or pursue things I might not or you might not. We won't know until someone finds it. But I suspect they're just going to be a pretty smart person. I don't think they have to be a genius. I don't think we have to be a genius or I wouldn't be in this hunt. This whole story I'm telling you is just me picking up on something because I'm old enough to remember Howard Hughes. And of course, Ben would be plenty old enough to remember Howard Hughes. Okay. At 8:30, Lillian Gish, this is an older Hollywood person. Gloria Swanson is in this too. Gloria Swanson, another before my time type that was was retired. Was retired when I was growing up, but you could still see her in movies, old movies that were on at 11 o'clock at night or whatever on TV. Blanche Sweet. I don't even know who Blanche Sweet is, but I suspect she's probably another, probably another beautiful Hollywood leading lady type or something. I literally don't know who she is. The dinner party was almost over before Howard arrived. First, it started off saying, for the illegal martinis, Ella ordered many cases of bootleg gin. Can you imagine? Much of it imported from Britain. So here's an environment where people are all at this big dinner dance, and they're all drinking illegal alcohol. Quite the to-do. And Blanche Sweet says, the dinner party was almost over before Howard arrived. By the way, Howard Hughes was a teetotaler. He didn't drink at all. Drank tea, totally. Teetotaler. The dinner party was almost over before Howard arrived. Blanche Sweet would later recall, I think it was almost 9:30. He was dressed like a bum, and his white shirt was stained like he had dripped soup on it. He wore a pair of corduroy slacks in some ghastly shade of cow shit brown. He wore no stockings, but the dirtiest pair of tennis shoes ever seen. They looked like they had been at a hog calling contest in Mississippi. Now, something that's interesting about Howard Hughes and sad about Howard Hughes, if you follow his life, and for those of you who don't know who Howard Hughes is, or you've just briefly heard of him, or maybe you saw The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio, that right there shows you that he had some mental problems as he got older. Howard Hughes was big on flying planes, building planes, and setting speed records. He had had a couple of crashes, I believe. He had injured himself numerous times, his head. I'm not going to go into all the injuries, but he, for whatever reason, had various injuries to his head. He had OCD as he got older, obsessive compulsive disorder. He had a lot of problems, and the thing is, when he got really old and was an older man in his 70s and stuff, he was Fruit Loops. He was, he wouldn't touch things, germs, germophobic, etc. But now, at this time, Howard Hughes, when Forrest Fenn would have been in his teenage years, what's this? Oh yeah, Howard Hughes in the 1940s. Howard Hughes, what was Howard Hughes doing? Howard Hughes in the 1940s was involved with Big Deal in Washington, D.C. Specifically, 1947. 1947, why was Howard Hughes in Washington, D.C.? You can look it up. You can actually watch the testimony. The whole country watched it. The whole country was glued to the TV set. And Howard Hughes' famous run-ins where he talks to the Senate. I think Brewer or Brewster was the senator he really took on. And what was that about? Well, Howard Hughes had been, over the years, as an aeronautics engineer, his Hughes aircraft or whatever it was, he had companies. He still has, I think, medical companies or hospitals. I don't care to even get into all that. But he had a huge company. The Hughes Corporation or whatever it is, don't pin me down on that, is still viable, still exists. He was brought before the Senate because he was taking too long to build this some planes that he had been promised to build for the Air Force, the military. And he had one particular plane called the Hercules, and it was gigantic. I'll put pictures up, of course, like I always do. It's huge. And a couple of things I'd like to say about that I only learned recently. This you'll see from the pictures, this plane was humongous. Well, the problem is the war was getting to the end, and they still didn't. They had put all this money into Hughes to build this plane, and this is going to be this huge plane for transferring cargo and material. And he still hadn't produced it. He still hadn't come up with it. So suddenly, someone went after Hughes and thought Hughes was just making a profit off this and didn't even plan to really build a plane that flew. You got to go back and watch the testimony. Hughes gets incensed. if this thing doesn't fly, I'm going to leave the country, and I'm not kidding. I mean, it was really a big deal. This happened in 1947 in Washington, D.C., and not a pleasant time for Howard Hughes. Probably the worst time of his life, having to go before the Senate and basically say, I'm not a corrupt person just taking money to build planes that I'm never going to produce for you. Goes on to be a deal where Howard Hughes actually flies this plane, the Hercules, gets off the ground, or gets off the water like 70 feet, and then he puts it down again, but he proves it could fly. They called it a nickname, they called it the Spruce Goose. This plane, at the time that this big event happened, was built of wood. But it wasn't built of spruce. It was built of birch, primarily. But even more importantly, that was a prototype, folks. And I did not know that until just recently. That the wooden Spruce Goose, that I always thought, how the hell are you going to fly around a bunch of troops and tanks and stuff in a plane? This biggest plane ever made in the world. How are you going to do that if it's wooden? Well, because it was just a prototype. He had not gone on to build a metal version of it. So, interesting. Folks, do you think that's unbelievable? Do you think that's what's going on with this story with Fenn? Do you think, in fact, that was Howard Hughes that was with that group of men who had escaped the rigor of Washington, D.C. in 1947 and literally gone to spend a night or two in Yellowstone? You tell me. You fit all the, you go read that story, and that weird story that starts off with this innocent camping trip to Yellowstone, Grebe Lake, and turns into huge black limousines with tinted windows and men in suits, one of who the leader is wearing a suit back in the 1940s with a pair of tennis shoes. What? I mean, I read that and I just went, who in the 40s was walking around wearing suits with tennis shoes, white tennis? Oh, that's right, it was Howard Hughes. And then I look at the rest of it and I go, wait a minute, when was Howard Hughes in Washington, D.C.? Because I remember all that. It would have been 1947. How old was Forrest Fenn in 1947? He was 17. I mean, it's like, wow. And quite frankly, why did Forrest Fenn feel it necessary to go flatten these guys' tires? Just because they happened to get a camping spot that he would have preferred to have, but they didn't know Forrest Fenn from fettuccine. So, well, I don't, that shows a side of Forrest Fenn that's pretty weird. Okay. But someone probably out there in the back row is going, yeah, but why? What's the point? Okay, here is the weird point. And I agree, this for me is even weirder than the rest of the story, which is fantastic as it sounds, I believe is very believable. And I'll end it on this. Do-do-do-do-do-do. One plane that Forrest Fenn built, not the Hercules, not the huge transport thing that got him in trouble and they were accusing him of stealing money when he had to go to Washington, D.C. in 1947 and defend his name, to defend his name. Earlier than that, in his life, Forrest Fenn, Howard Hughes built a racer in 1935. I'm sorry, I'll put up the name of it in the picture of it. Really pretty cool looking plane, especially for 1935. But Howard Hughes, an aeronautical engineer, built it. Oh, I gotta go. Someone's here. Bye.